Welcome to Everyday Economics, a weekly podcast about the economics in daily life. I'm your host, Puja Mehra.
It seems logical that the more a country exports, the more people of that country will get employed, and the more it imports, the fewer jobs will be available. This is the sort of reasoning that often leads to calls such as boycott Chinese-made products. But does this satisfy economic logic? India's post-independence economic history shows how the most well-meaning policies can have disastrous unintended consequences. Driven by sentiment of self-reliance and the scarcity of foreign exchange, newly independent India adopted the strategy of import substitution in the 1950s. This meant that all the goods that could be produced at home, no matter how inefficiently and at what cost, were struck off the import list. The chief objective was to ensure India could rapidly industrialize and build a self-reliant economy. By the late 1970s, though, there was growing disillusionment with this strategy. Some of India's most distinguished economists had showed it had given rise to an inefficient and high-cost domestic industry which produced goods that could not compete in world markets. It is important to mention here a book that had come out in 1964. It was called India's Export Trends and Prospects for Self-Sustained Growth. This book explained the reasons for the export stagnation from 1951 to 1960. In this period, world trade was booming. Indian exports, however, shrank 13%. The book concluded that India's export performance in 1970-71 was likely to greatly fall short of the export requirements of self-sustained growth. The author of this book went on to become a distinguished economist, then finance minister, and then Prime Minister of India. This forgotten book is basically Dr. Manmohan Singh's PhD thesis. Despite its adverse fallout, the import substitution strategy endured for 40-50 years after independence before it was abandoned as part of the 1991 reforms. In 1994, as Finance Minister, Dr. Singh defended India's progress in putting an end to import substitution and controls in Parliament. I've selected and paraphrased a few sentences. This is what he said. In the name of import substitution, we have tried to regulate everything possible. In the process, we have become an economy which is over-regulated and under-governed. For the last 44 years, we have talked of self-reliance. If the country takes the task of self-reliance seriously, it has no option but to have an economic structure which enables the gap between imports and exports to be filled. That is possible under Indian conditions only through a massive increase in exports. If you want a massive increase in exports, your industry has to be efficient. Your agriculture has to be efficient. My guest today is Dr. Rajat Kathuria. He is the Director and Chief Executive of Indian Council for Research on International Economic Relations, ICRIER, New Delhi, and has worked with the World Bank, ILO, UNCTAD, and ADB. I asked him if boycotting Chinese-made products is one way to ensure success of Make in India. Dr. Kathuria, welcome to Everyday Economics. Thank you for making time to be on the show.
Not at all. Pleasure to be here.
Dr. Kathuria, after independence, Pandit Nehru's vision for the economy, in his own words, was of self-reliance. Prime Minister Narendra Modi has given it a new name of Atmanirbhar Bharat, but the vision is essentially Pandit Nehru's vision. For results, visions are translated into strategies, and Union Minister Nitin Gadkari has articulated the government's chosen economic philosophy and strategy of import substitution. He has asked Indian industry to come up with cost-effective substitutes for reducing imports. Home Minister Amit Shah has also said that India's economy would gain if its 130 crore population decided to stop buying foreign goods, and investments will increase if everyone uses made in India products. There are calls for boycotting China-made products. Before we talk about the Modi government's strategy of import substitution, please share some insights about the import substitution strategy of the 1950s, 60s, and 70s. What economic and industrial structures did import substitution create back then, immediately after independence, and what long-term effects have those had on India's industrial competitiveness?
So, the import substitution policies that were put in place beginning the 1950s and 60s was with a view to build Indian industry. There was a lot of market failure post-independence, and market failure in the sense that private capital was unlikely to come into an economy that was newly independent, and therefore the public sector stepped in. And in order to provide the public sector the space to invest, there was a move or an initiative to try and sort of block imports for the benefit of Indian industry. And this is an industrialization strategy that has been followed by many, many countries. And it was sort of intellectually the flavor of the times as well. One had looked at the infant industry argument. There was an infant industry argument also around at that time. And I think India was not alone in doing what it was doing in trying to promote domestic industry in the background of, I think, deep-seated market failures, and also trying to, at the same time, sort of provide for its population in terms of creating jobs, in terms of creating investments, so that over time one could then integrate with the global economy and then begin to engage more with the global economy. Unfortunately, we got the first, part of it right, in the sense that we were able to create a space for public investment and some private investment. But we were able to do that. But unfortunately, we were not able to remove those controls and the licensing and what eventually came to be called the license Raj. We were unable to remove those controls that we had put into place. As I said, intellectually, that was motivated by the infant industry argument. The infant industry argument, just for a moment, just to dwell on that, is to try and protect the infant until it grows up, and then to liberalize and let it engage and compete with the rest of the world. That engagement and that liberalization never happened. And as you said, a number of economists in India, most particularly, I think, Professor Jagdish Bhagwati, has articulated his criticism about those policies. They kept getting more and more entrenched, and it became more difficult to come out. So once you provide for subsidies, or once you provide for licensing, getting out of them in normal times becomes extremely difficult. And that is what happened, I think, in India through the various plans, through the various years, is that more and more investments happened on the back of protectionism. And therefore, you had an industry that was selling high-priced, low-quality products to a captive audience where it did not have to compete with anybody. And then once it becomes so entrenched, it becomes difficult to try and unravel that or remove all those controls to products that were made in India. So the import substitution regime, I think, gave India some good things, but I think the negative spillovers of the import substitution regime had become too many, and therefore, were a part, I think, the reason why we, reached the crisis stage in 1991. Over time, along with the import substitution regime, we experimented with a number of other things, and we experimented with also export promotion. And, export promotion and import substitution, as we know now through global markets and global value chains, are not policies that can both be successful together. We now know that. And we were, in terms of exporting, we were, I think, underconfident about ourselves in the 60s and 70s, and I think continue to remain underconfident about our exports. And I think this found manifestation in the phrase that was very popular in Indian discourse at that time, in Indian development writings at that time, one which was called elasticity pessimism, which is that the products that we export to sort of global markets or to markets abroad are products that have a low elasticity of demand. These are primary products, and these are sort of made in the primary sector, and therefore have a low elasticity of demand, and therefore, even if we reduce prices, became competitive, develop economies of scale, there is only so much that we'll be able to sell. And because we had import substitution, exports were negligible, and we were only able to export very little in the global market, and we almost had no presence in the global markets as far as exports were concerned. So we were an economy whose trade to GDP ratio was low. We exported very little. We imported some things, not a whole lot of things. We imported some things, and therefore our domestic product market especially became flooded with delays, was encumbered with delays in consumers finding the right products, were high price, and were, of course, of poor quality.
The strategy of import substitution may have had compelling reasons in early years of independence. Prominent critics of those policies include Professor Jagdish Bhagwati, Professor Arun Panagria, both of who are friends of Prime Minister Modi. Dr. Isha Ahluwalia has showed in 1987 the precise links between industrial strategy and deceleration in industrial growth. She showed the administrative burdens in systems of physical controls, adverse effect on entrepreneurship of rent-seeking, difficulty in carrying out long-term corporate planning, high-cost, inefficient industries, and all of the defects of indiscriminate and indefinite protection given to domestic industry from foreign competition. Why is India then reverting to import substitution? Is this a good policy move?
So let me try and address the first question and try and nuance the two phases, if you will. One, which is the current phase where we are trying to make in India through increasing tariffs on select items or by, trying, there's a sort of call to boycott products from China. So sort of this form of sort of import substitution or making in India and juxtapose it with the import substitution regime that we had put in place in the post-independence period, which continued, as I said, until 1991. So I think there are fundamental differences in these two approaches. And those differences are the fact that today the average tariff for India is less than 10%. And the tariffs that we had seen in the pre-91 period, they could have gone up to 400%. So we were a very, very controlled economy then. We were completely import substituting in the sense that we did not give licenses for production beyond a certain capacity. Broadbanding or product differentiation was not allowed. So there was this extreme form of protectionism, and this was almost micromanagement of industry. There was micromanagement of production, and there was micromanagement of both economies of scale and economies of scope. And that was possible because of this administrative nightmare that came to be called India in terms of production. And then that was also then reinforced by a very protectionist regime. So import competition was almost non-existent. That regime and this regime of sort of increasing tariffs incrementally and trying to promote Make in India is, I think there are two different regimes because the average tariff for India today is very low. Our engagement on international trade has gone up to almost 35% of GDP. We are a part of some value chains like pharmaceuticals and automobiles, and hopefully in mobile phones and electronics, we will become a big player in the value chain. So I think the two regimes need to be differentiated and they are fundamentally different. The second question is whether this is a good policy. I think we had very hard-earned gains post-1991 to be able to become competitive in a number of industries, and those hard-earned gains were as a result of product market liberalization. To a large extent, we've succeeded in product market liberalization and reform, and those gains were as a result of that. And why I'm calling them hard-earned gains is because it took a long time, and it took a 1991 sort of macroeconomic and a balance of payment crisis for us to engage in them. And therefore, I'm calling them hard-earned reforms. We would have had to do them anyway, because as you yourself said in your remarks, in your question, that regime had become unsustainable and it would have collapsed under its own weight, as has been shown by many, many researchers. Incrementally, I mean, because of political compulsions and because of wanting to promote Make in India, the instrument of trade policy or protectionism is being used because that is, I think, genuinely thought in the administration that that would help promote Make in India. And you know that in the electronics industry, a certain package has been announced recently, which tries to incentivize production-linked incentives for production of laptops and smartphones in India, and some of that might happen. So I think if you ask me whether this is a good policy, I think for two reasons I wouldn't sort of support the policy, and I would think there are alternative instruments. One, if you want to promote Make in India, there could be other reasons why there are handicaps in industry, and these are very well known, and a lot of industry knows that. That is sort of, making ease of doing business more uh, sort of achievable, or improving the ease of doing business would be a better way to attract investment, both domestic and foreign. And secondly, the signals that this sends, not only in India, but to the rest of the world, that we are willing to use tariff instruments of protectionism to promote domestic industry, signals, as your questions also shows, that we are going back to the old regime. But I think that's not true. But there is a signal, there is a perception, and I think that perception is best avoided, because it is at this time that India needs the global market much more than it has ever needed. And let me just pause a moment and explain that. If you look at manufacturing and production across the world, it has moved to places where there have been labor cost advantages, and investments have moved to those sort of countries. And I think this is a time for those investments to come to India, to be attracted into India, because India enjoys a labor cost advantage. However, India's labor cost advantage is often offset by other disadvantages that I'm speaking about in terms of the ease of doing business. And if we address those, then it might be better a way to attract investment. A lot of research has shown that a 10% sort of increase in tariff versus a 10% reduction in logistic costs, if you compare those in terms of what it affords to the economy, it is shown that a 10% reduction in sort of logistic costs gives a better bang for a buck to exports than a 10% increase in tariffs, or to competitiveness than a 10% increase in tariffs.
Dr. Dr. Kathuria, when we hear of something like boycott China, it has a mass appeal to it. But is India chasing the wrong policy goals? Like you've also just said, shouldn't competitiveness be the policy objective? And I often say that, instead of ease of doing business, we should probably have ease of being competitive rankings. It's all right to make in India, but you cannot just make anything. You have to make something which is going to be competitive globally. That nuance, I think, sometimes get missed out.
This is a good moment for me to sort of dwell on something that I think one of the Nobel laureates in economics, called Paul Samuelson, had said when he was asked, what is something in economics that is non-trivial and true at the same time? And he had responded by saying it is the law of comparative advantage. And that is something that people often have great difficulty in appreciating and following. And I think trade suffers from sort of, it often gets captured by political interests without sort of going back to the idea of comparative advantage. It is true that we can do almost anything better than some other countries in South Asia, and it is equally true that the United States can probably do everything better than so many other countries, but still there is benefit in trade, because there are some things that they can relatively do better than others, and therefore they focus on what is their comparative advantage. And this idea of comparative advantage gave rise to the idea of sort of economies of scale or intra-industry trade due to Paul Krugman. So you have comparative advantage. There are things that I will do relatively better. And then there is this idea of economies of scale, where if I continue to produce something at scale, something that China has showed, then I can do that at lower cost and trade with the world. If you combine the idea of comparative advantage and you combine the idea of scale, then you have within China, you have examples of cities and clusters that were making only a single product that they were exporting to the rest of the world. And those clusters and those cities that made specific products became competitive across the world because there was comparative advantage. China had labor cost advantage, and it reinforced its labor cost advantage with scale. And this is something that we ought to emulate, and this is something that we ought to do. So India has consistently lost those sort of opportunities. The first opportunity was when Chinese wages were growing. The second opportunity was when Sino-US trade war was happening. And this pandemic actually provides another opportunity where companies and investors are looking for alternative destinations to diversify value chains, to make value chains more resilient. So I think you're absolutely right in the premise of your question that we should find ways of attracting investment by doing ease of competitiveness because we have comparative advantage. And because we have comparative advantage in labor-intensive industries, we can reinforce that comparative advantage by providing ease of doing business, ease of locating in India, building clusters, building large scale so that we become the low-cost producer for the world. Unfortunately, some of those investments that are vacating China are finding alternative destinations like Vietnam and Cambodia and Indonesia and not coming to India. And the first thing that, or the things that people say when you talk to investors, why don't you locate in India? The answers that you get are things that are not sort of unknown to India and to Indians. And those answers are typically power, logistics. Labor laws are important, but labor laws figure fairly low down in the hierarchy of handicaps that people talk about. I think power availability, administrative sort of clearances, etc., are more sort of prominent in the list of handicaps than labor law. Of course, labor law also finds its way into the list of problems, but it's not up there. So I think the way we should approach this now is use this pandemic as an opportunity not to disengage with the rest of the world, but engage with the rest of the world much more by trying to locate those value chains in India, trying to get the advantage of scale, which I think we can through building of clusters, try to reinforce our labor cost advantage, which still exists. Unfortunately, a lot of people say that labor cost advantage might be going away due to automation and technology. But I think for India, it will remain. There is an immediacy bias in what I'm going to say, but maybe there won't be another opportunity to try and reinforce labor-intensive or try and attract labor-intensive manufacturing in India, which we so desperately need given our demographic profile. There won't be another opportunity. So it is best now that this is exploited. This is a 1991 moment for us in terms of engaging in large-scale reform to attract investments.
Crises do offer greater leeway for corrections. I also want to talk a little now about the trade between China and India. What is the nature of this trade? What is India's dependence on Chinese imports? And can it really be reduced by calls such as boycott China?
I think an example that I can give you is China's trade with the United States. And if you look at, and not only the United States, in Europe as well, if you cursorily look at the products that are available in the United States in their grocery stores, in their supermarkets, in their markets, and it would be flooded with Chinese products. And there was a huge market for those products because consumers would vote with their wallet and would buy those products because they were cheap, they were inexpensive, and it made sense for them to buy. So boycotting is an emotional call. I mean, some people might boycott, but given the fact that they're cheaper, they're relatively inexpensive, I don't think a call to boycott would have the same degree of success, let's say, of just banning the products. If you didn't want to consume Chinese products, they could sort of ban them. This is just a thought experiment. That would be much more effective than voices or calls to boycotting. It's an emotional call. It's sort of partly political, but I don't think it will succeed. Do you want it to succeed? Do you want Chinese products to be boycotted in India so they cannot sell? I think one has to distinguish between final products that the consumers will buy and intermediate products that will be used by industry. And if you look at the pattern of trade that we have with China, our imports are mainly in intermediate goods and capital goods. I mean, there are some consumer goods that come in, but a lot of the trade, the $100 billion trade that we do with China, almost touching 100 billion, and we are running a deficit of over $50 billion. A lot of that is because we are importing components, especially electronic components, adding value, and then re-exporting them or selling them as final products in the domestic market or in the foreign market. So I think to disengage with China immediately will be extremely disruptive and would be counterproductive for India. And the way to disengage, if at all we wanted to do that, since some of our value chains are deeply integrated with the Chinese value chains, if we wanted to do that, we would have to slowly calibrate and take advantage of sort of this pandemic, as I said, is try and get those investments into India so that those products are beginning to be made in India rather than importing components from China. But that can happen only over a period of time. You can't wish it away immediately because of our deep engagement with the value chain in China. And China is one of our largest trading partners today. So I don't think it's a good idea to do that. It's sort of trade, in a general sense, trade, Puja, has also acquired recently much more of a political hue than it had in the past. And you see that across the world, not only in India. It has become political, and a lot of the trade agreements sort of have become political. If you remember, the EU came together because they thought that greater interdependence between the European Union countries would pave the way for peace. So trade was seen as an instrument to achieving peace because economic interdependencies would tend to sort of make the cost of conflict very, very high, and therefore trade was sort of made possible within the countries of the European Union. And to a large extent, the recent FTAs, the renegotiations of NAFTA, US withdrawal from the TPP, India not joining the RCEP. I mean, these have sort of an economic logic to them, but I think they also have a political logic to them. And what the balance of political and economic logic could vary, but trade has begun to acquire political overtones. I wouldn't even say undertones. It has begun to acquire political overtones. And another manifestation of that is often that trade gets to be the target of other infirmities or other weaknesses within the domestic economies. Like if there's a problem with employment, the President of the United States would often say that this is because those jobs are being taken away by outsourcing to countries like China and India, and therefore you want to reshore those jobs. And migration becomes a sort of victim of that. So trade becomes a target for other problems that exist in domestic economies. And two of the problems that has caused globalization to get a bad name, one is inequality and the other is jobs. Jobs are being exported and inequality is being increased as a result of increasing engagement in international trade becomes the sort of rhetoric. And I think rather than international trade, there are other domestic instruments that could be used to address the problems of job creation, address the problems of inequality, rather than laying the blame at the doorstep of globalization or international trade. But one has to be a realist and say that, yes, there is a balance of political and economic objectives that every country needs to deal with when engaging in negotiations. And I think RCEP, to conclude answering your question, RCEP sort of in India had become a surrogate. I think it was viewed as a surrogate for a free trade agreement with China. And the view was that it would sort of deeply damage our domestic industry. Whether that would or would not, one doesn't know what the counterfactual would be. But our engagement with China is very, very high. And not all of it is negative. Some of our engagement with China in an economic sense is positive because trade is, at the end of the day, a positive sum game.
Dr. Kathuria, the popular joke doing the rounds these days actually captures what you said so well. You said that world over, business is not guided by emotions, it's guided by cold profit calculations. And The joke is that Chinese factories have already increased their output of T-shirts with the message "Boycott China" placed prominently on these T-shirts in anticipation of increased demand from India. But what I want to say is that, like you said, of the way politics plays out in the US on jobs and trade, the connection between the two, and how you spoke of RCEP, India balking at the at signing on the dotted line, even though Prime Minister was present at the summit and negotiations were going on, and he returned from there last minute, uh, where there were concerns about imports of dairy from small countries like New Zealand, and the economic situation in India, where we've had for now more than 10 years the problem of few jobs, few sustainable livelihoods getting created in our economic model. Uh, Going forward, there are going to be complications for trade policy, and politics and trade will get intertwined more. There will be emotional responses, and therefore there's going to be need for the policymakers to be more and more focused on policy objectives, on what can increase India's export competitiveness. Here, so given this is what needs to be done, and you've given also the specifics of what needs to be done in terms of increasing ease of doing business, in the last 10 years, how much progress have you seen on this front? And I'm a little pessimistic on this because before the global financial crisis hit Indian exports, they were, of course, doing quite well. The global economy was booming and global demand for exports was increasing, and India was able to take advantage of that. But after the global financial crisis, the hit that exports took and Indian manufacturing took, even today, almost 10 years later, India has not recovered from that. And for the last 6 years, we've had a policy of Make in India, and we've really nothing to show for what it has produced in terms of concrete increase in industrial production or export competitiveness or exports growth. So, are you optimistic? Because I am a little pessimistic about the way things are turning out.
Yes, indeed. One can look at the glass as half full or the glass as half empty. I sort of look at the glass as half full, but I agree with your position that it has become a more complex world today, especially after the global financial crisis, where protectionism has taken on different hues. It has taken on different shades. It's no longer the tariff sort of protection that you see, but you see protection in the form of standards and non-tariff barriers, which is what the Trans-Pacific Partnership was all about. It was all about standards rather than about tariffs and protection being used through tariffs. So the world, in terms of trade, has moved on in terms of how it protects domestic economies. And also, I think there has been a pervasiveness of global value chains, a greater diffusion of global value chains. When you open a product today, be it an automobile or a laptop or a smartphone, and you see the number of countries that that product is made in, would astound somebody who doesn't follow the subject. It could be 40 to 50 countries. Components move into and move out of countries and finally are produced at a destination and embedded as final products and then sold. So there's a crisscrossing of components and parts that are moving across countries as a result of this diffusion of global value chains. And this has been made possible because of globalization, because of the reductions in transportation costs, because of the reduction in logistics costs, and especially, as somebody had said, containerization, which made shipping so much more easy and cost effective. So communications cost, containerization gave rise to reinforced comparative advantage and gave rise to global value chains. And this has become sort of fragmented and they are all over the world. And therefore, it is a much more complex environment than the environment that we started with podcast with, which is, two countries trading with one another based on comparative advantage in either technology or labor intensive products. So the world has become more complex. And therefore, policy also has to become more nuanced at this time. And it's unfortunate for India that we are looking at a new kind of protectionism in the world today than we saw in the past, because it was easier to negotiate away tariffs, but it's much more difficult to negotiate standards, etc., and to conform to standards. And that also becomes a little more political. And therefore, I think it's unfortunate that India is facing this sort of an environment where there is a new kind of protectionism, and at the same time, the demand for goods and services because of falling incomes is becoming low. So for both those reasons, lower demand and for greater sort of protectionism, India will have to find ways to engage in global markets. And one way to engage in global markets is to put your money where your mouth is, which is to say that, not only spread the perception that you are becoming open, but also create that, perception within the market, and by doing things that make you more open. And if you become more open, then you'll be able to sort of engage more productively with the global market. So what I'm saying is that, yes, I agree, Puja, that it is much more a difficult time for India to try and prize over global markets, but we have to do it. If the focus is on competitiveness, if we have to become competitive both in the domestic economy and, of course, then in the global economy, and the experience of the 60s and 70s shows us is that we have to engage internationally. No country has become competitive. No country has been able to export to the rest of the world without engaging productively and efficiently with the rest of the world. And therefore, I think it's extremely important for India to do that. When value chains are moving around the countries, when they are becoming fragmented and we want to attract them, the two things that companies fear the most in trying to relocate is uncertainty and protectionism. These are the two things that you don't want. You don't want uncertainty, and you don't want at least signals of perceptions that India is becoming more protectionist. I think standards are, if you're going to be exporting, especially services, it could be health services, it could be education or services, or even agricultural products, then I think standards are going to be important. And the TPP, which, as I said, the US walked out of, was all about standards. It was about competition policy, it was about intellectual property, it was about labor standards, it was about state-owned enterprises. It was, how the product is made. And if I were to just go back to the idea of comparative advantage and Ricardo, if you will, if you permit me a minute, countries generated comparative advantage largely because of the labor cost advantage. And often the United States used to complain about China, that China has this comparative advantage because it does not meet labor standards, there are sweatshops, and their wages needed to be increased because they did not have any minimum wages, etc. Now, if you try and harmonize those standards across the two countries, let's say United States and China, what you're essentially doing is taking away a source of comparative advantage that China has. So standards have the added sort of issue or the problem that you might, if you harmonize standards, you might be sort of moderating the advantage that one country has over the other. And to that extent, it may not be a good thing. But some of the standards, like state-owned enterprises or complying with intellectual property, those are standards that I think India will eventually have to address if it wants to become competitive, then it will have to address some of those standards. For example, if we become exporter of intellectual property, today we are an importer of intellectual property, and therefore we have a certain regime in place. Tomorrow, if India begins to export intellectual property or products that are intensive in intellectual property or intensive in technology, then we might want to protect our rights in global markets, just like the United States wants to protect today its rights over products that it sells in emerging markets like China, which is one of the reasons for the Sino-US trade war. So I think standards are going to, as trade becomes more sort of complex as services become a more important component of international trade and global trade. Standards are going to become important as well. Even in products, service standards are important, but I think they will become even more important as trade becomes more sort of complex and more service oriented.
The example that I always give when young students ask me about this is that I tell them that will your cricket team be the world's best cricket team if it was only playing Ranji cricket and domestic cricket, or if it was protected against competition from the best cricket teams of the world? And I think that analogy almost always gets me the response that now we get it, why it's important to be competitive and not protective. So much has been said about the setback to globalization, but from all that you've said today, it seems to me that you do not think that there is going to be any setback to globalization. It may evolve as any phenomenon or dynamic does. Before I close the episode, for listeners interested in reading more about India's trade, please could you share your recommendations for books and articles? We've spoken about many economists, Professor Jagdish Bhagwati, Dr. Manmohan Singh, David Ricardo, Paul Samuelson, Paul Krugman. What are some of the books and articles that people can read?
So I think the books that Paul Krugman has written on economic geography, I think would be a good reference for what I've spoken about. There is a very good article by Paul Krugman, again, A Country is Not a Company, which is also a good reading on international trade. Paul Samuelson's writings are excellent. Our own Professor Jagdish Bhagwati, T.N. Srinivasan, and Arvind Panagaria have an article in the Journal of Economic Perspective on the new trade, the new fragmentation of trade and the new value chains version of trade. And I think that's also a very, very good article because it says the theory of international trade doesn't need to be changed because of the advent of global value chains. Because a lot of people were saying this is a new form of trade. We're not just exporting and importing final products. These are components and parts that are being traded through global value chains across countries. So we need a new theory of trade because this is this fragmentation that is happening, and therefore we need a new theory of trade. In a very persuasive article in the Journal of Economic Perspectives, Professors Bhagwati, Srinivasan, the late Professor Srinivasan, and Arvind Panagaria, who used to be heading Niti Aayog until a few years ago, they have written an excellent article which I would recommend to everybody to read because it's really a primer on the kind of trade that exists between countries today. And one last thing, Puja, I would like to say is that, which is what you said about my sort of optimism about globalization. And I agree with that characterization. I always like to see the glass as half full, and I am sort of by nature an optimist. But I would also say that the experience of the post-war era and the experience, particularly in India post-independence, about autarky or being hermetic in the approach to international trade, if you take a long enough view, you will see that it doesn't work because no country can go on producing for the domestic market in a self-reliant sort of way. And I like the analogy that you have given about the cricket team. I like that analogy very much. So, going back to autarky or hermeticism today is not on the table at all. It's not going to happen. They're going to be, countries are going to leverage their bargaining power as much as possible, as the United States is doing, in trying to garner benefits to themselves in trade negotiations. But going back to this closed autarkic economy is not possible. Globalization has come too long away. There are too much of production networks that have been set up. Disrupting them would be hugely disruptive for the world and for incomes and for consumption. So I think globalization is there to stay. As you said, it will stay in a different nature. There will be a different flavor to it, but trade will continue to happen. It will see ups and downs, but I think the secular movement of trade will be towards increase in the long run.
Thank you, Dr. Kathuria. It's been great listening to your views and so insightful and so informative. Thanks a lot.
Thank you. All the best.
Thank you.